Good morning. Welcome everyone to this event hosted by the Multi-Faith Advisory Council and UN entities. I'm Casey Harden. I'm the General Secretary of the World YWCA. And in that role, I also serve as co-chair of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council. It is tremendous to have you here today as we explore the misconceptions that often exist around the role of faith actors in achieving the 2030 agenda. At the World YWCA, we often say that gender equality, the advancement of women and girls, feminism, it is not mutually exclusive from the work of faith. And that is broadly what we will explore today. The event today is organized by the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, as I mentioned, and that's a council to the United Nations. It's comprised of over 40 global faith-based organizations working in partnership with the United Nations and nominated by the 26 United Nations entities who form the UN Interagency Task Force on Religion and Sustainable Development. The event today was developed by a number of faith-based organizations that are very committed to the belief that we must bring and celebrate faith actors and faith organizations into the work to achieve the SDGs. And also the event today is co-sponsored by UNFPA and the UN Alliance of Civilizations. So as I've said, the vision for today is to dispel misconceptions and myths and share a very strong perspective, and that's that faith actors can and do advance gender equality. More specifically, given the misconceptions that negatively identify religion as an obstacle to gender equality and actually can be the basis of harmful practices, we'll talk about really demonstrating the role of faith actors in driving good change for gender equality. We'll share a few faith-based methodologies, really the proof in the pudding that we're advancing gender equality. And we'll highlight key opportunities for collaboration, synergies, learning, and cooperation among stakeholders, some stakeholders that typically don't work together, to engage in the promotion of pluralistic societies and gender equality. So we're having this conversation today in a very sobering context. Since the adoption of the 2030 agenda, there's undoubtedly been progress on gender equality and women's empowerment. But despite these gains, many challenges remain. Discriminatory laws and social norms are pervasive. Women continue to be underrepresented at all levels of political leadership, and 1 in 5 women and girls between the ages of 15 and 49 every year will report experiencing physical or sexual violence by an intimate partner. There are many examples such as that, and moreover, the COVID-19 pandemic, we know that it exacerbated existing inequalities for women and girls across every sphere and in every region, and we've seen that the impact of the pandemic continues to risk reversing limited progress that's been made or has already reversed progress that has been made in gender equality. We know that this gender equality that we talk about will only be achieved when everyone enjoys the same opportunities, rights, and obligations in all spheres of their life. And that such a lofty goal, such as the SDGs, requires intervention at all levels. This includes ending discrimination, eliminating violence and harmful practices, recognizing unpaid care and domestic work, ensuring women's participation in decision-making, ensuring access to sexual and reproductive health and rights, as well as to economic rights and justice. And we know that faith constituencies are crucial actors to address all of those types of interventions. 84% of the global population identify with a spiritual tradition, religious, or belief group. And while exclusionary interpretations do instrumentalize religions, beliefs, or their followers for electoral purposes or political gains, often at the expense of women and other oppressed minority groups, and religious language rooted in human rights framing has historically been proven to be a source of nonviolent transformation. So these two things alongside each other in defense of human rights and equality, and integrity in government, and reconciliation and stability in divided societies. Religious leaders rooted within communities, they often hold a unique level of legitimacy and trust because they live and serve affected communities. They know the local context and the families they serve, and they're trusted members of the community because of that. So today, in the face of global challenges like COVID-19, geopolitical tension, when our world more than ever needs collaborative efforts to achieve gender equality, we are today sharing perspectives and learnings from a number of contexts where religious actors and local partners, especially women and girls, are catalytic forces for pluralistic society. So today we have expert speakers and a moderated panel discussion from faith-based organizations to show how commitment can lead to transformative change with a goal to inspire increased governmental, UN, and civil society partnership with faith-based actors to motivate other faith actors even to join forces and raise the level of ambition to achieve gender equality. We'll challenge the misconceptions that faith actors are only the problem and to increase understanding that faith actors are also part of the solution and should be an integral part of multi-stakeholder approaches to accelerating gender equality. During our discussion today, there will be opportunities to ask for any IT support in the chat pod, and also the Q&A component will be available to submit questions from the audience, but also know that when you registered, you had an opportunity to share commentary or questions, and those have been received and are ready to be shared with the panel when we get to that part of today's program. So without further ado, I have the pleasure to introduce Mr. Arthur Erkin. Arthur is the director of the Policy and Strategy Division at UNFPA. He joined the organization in 1993 and has held various senior level positions in the field and in headquarters, including Director of Communications and Strategic Partnerships. Currently, he provides leadership for UNFPA's strategic planning and programmatic support, including the faith-based program portfolio. Arthur, we're tickled to have you with us today. Please.
Thank you so much, Casey, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, friends and colleagues. I'm really delighted to be able to join today's event on dispelling misconceptions and myths, faith actors advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, held at the margins of the high-level political forum that is currently ongoing here in New York. At the outset, I really would like to thank the organizers, the Multi-Faith Advisory Council to the United Nations Interagency Task Force on Religion and Sustainable Development, and our co-sponsors, the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations and the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect. The primary purpose of today's event, as also highlighted by Casey, is to really highlight the potential positive role that faith actors play in driving change for gender equality and dismantling the narrative that portrays religion as an obstacle to the realization of women's rights. In his most recent report on the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN Secretary General has been very clear, and that is that the world is not on track to achieve gender equality by 2030. In fact, according to the report, we are pushed further off track by multiple and interlinked global crises, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the climate crisis, and the impact of geopolitical tensions and conflicts. Alarmingly, the effects of these crises disproportionately affect women and girls who keep struggling with lost jobs and livelihoods, with derailed education, with increased burdens of unpaid work and domestic violence. During the height of the pandemic, women's health services, including shelters and one-stop crisis centers, faced major disruptions, cutting lifelines for survivors of violence and undermining women's sexual and reproductive health. Unfortunately, many countries still do not have comprehensive systems to track budgets for gender equality, limiting the allocation of public resources for implementation of laws and policies. To exacerbate the situation, we are witnessing a pervasive and relentless pushback on women's rights and gender justice. In fact, what we're observing today is a systematic pushback at the global and national levels, which too often uses religion and cultural arguments to oppose progress and push back on gender equality, instrumentalizing religion as a platform to launch mis- and disinformation campaigns. Friends and colleagues, faith actors are powerful allies for the United Nations, for governments, and human rights defenders in countering the pushback on gender equality and in actively promoting women's rights and empowerment. Religious leaders who are rooted within communities often hold a unique level of legitimacy, as Casey said, and trust, because they live in and serve affected communities, know the local context and the families they serve, and are therefore trusted members of the community. Today, in the face of global challenges such as COVID-19, when our world more than ever needs collaborative efforts to achieve gender equality, it is important to share perspectives and learnings from a number of contexts where religious actors are catalytic forces for the promotion of women's rights. At UNFPA, we have long recognized the potential positive role that faith can have in promoting gender equality. Let me share two examples of UNFPA's collaboration with faith actors just recently. In Somalia, we organized a series of roundtables, bringing together experts from the Al-Azhar University and Somali religious scholars to discuss the impact of female genital mutilation from a medical and from a religious perspective. And religious scholars agreed that any non-medical procedure involving the female reproductive organs is not in keeping with the Islamic teachings and is therefore forbidden by Islam. In Uganda, together with the Inter-Religious Council, we organized a radio talk show that was also televised nationwide to encourage positive masculinity and discourage communities against gender-based violence and harmful practices. In a TV live dialogue, senior Catholic, Muslim, and Evangelical religious leaders jointly advocated to end violence against women and girls and promote adolescent, sexual, and reproductive health services. Colleagues and friends, the COVID-19 pandemic exposed the fragility of health and gender-based violence protection systems, the importance of universal health coverage, and the necessity of promoting gender transformative, human rights-based and intersectoral approaches to sustainable development that will truly leave no one behind. Today, we know that only a radical, holistic, and urgent change of course, grounded in a renewed commitment to multilateralism and international cooperation, as called for by our Secretary General in his Our Common Agenda, will rescue the SDGs. And faith actors have an important role to play. The High-Level Political Forum is a critical opportunity to mobilize action to support our common goals on gender equality. And therefore, we hope at UNFPA that today's dialogue will set a critical step in this direction. I thank you.
Thank you so much, Arthur. It very much resonates when you talk about the potential and the positive role that faith actors will play. It's very succinct and well said. And in that and everything you said, again, I hear the promise or the opportunity or the challenge for us to really move toward that radical, holistic, and urgent change of course in order to achieve everything that we all envision together. It's really terrific to hear from you as a representative of one of our UN partners. And I want to take an opportunity yet again to highlight our UN collaborators on this event that, like the members of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, feel just as strongly and have that powerful vision for radical, holistic, and urgent change. The UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, UNFPA, and the UN Alliance of Civilizations, thank you so much for walking the talk of what collaboration can look like between faith organizations and the United Nations. Now we're going to turn to one of our role models in that type of collaboration within the Multi-Faith Advisory Council. And you're going to watch a video where you'll see some of that radical, holistic, and urgent change in action manifest. So with that, we have a video to watch together.
Imams for She ni kampanye yatangujwe na Muslim for Progressive Values, ibaye inspiré na kampanye ya He for She yatangujwe na Unifam mu mwaka wa 2014 ngaha mu Burundi cyatangura mu mwaka wa 2016. Ngaha mu Burundi la kampanye Imams for She imaze gushika ku bintu bitari bike, nko mu ntara twatanga karo nko mu ntara zitanu umugambi umaze gushikamwo cyane gose, ni nko ngaha i Bujumbura, i Makamba, Ingozi, Igitega hamwe ni Muyinga. Turamaze gushira ha makoperative ashika 32 atwagwa n'abagore nyene ubwabo. Aha twatanga akarero nk'ikoperative i Bujumbura mu Cibitoke, aho abafasoni bagiye hamwe bakaza barafuma amashuka, bararangura amashuka bakayafuma bakashora bakadandaza ngaho i Burundi bakongera bakayadandaza no hano hanze y'igihugu.
Ubunye twarahagurije abakenyezi bahaguruke umva n'ubundi turacakeneye kandi gatari nini kabanda kuko tuma twigisha
no ngaho i Bujumbura nyene abafasoni bagiye hamwe barashiraho ibutike bashobora badandaza bakaronka amafaranga inyungu ibateza imbere.
Tukira amashirahamwe kuko ibi byose ndabikesha impamvu bashima ntabwo bishima kandi birahimbaye babyo murabwira namwe muze twijurire amashirahamwe.
Nko mu ntara ya Gitega abapfasoni bafise imangazini nabo nyene kandi badandaza bakaronka ivyo bashobora bashasha kwiteza imbere.
Mwarakoze gose, twebwe tugira turara inzara, abana ntibarara inzara, turigurana tukariha, tuba tugifise umutahe, tuba dufise n'inyungu. Aha turatora akadeni k'ibifungurwa, tugatora akadeni k'amahera.
Twatanga karo kandi muri komine Mutaho aho abafasoni bagiye hamwe borora impene.
Nkuko abivuze, twebwe turabakenyezi b'Imutaho, komine Mutaho, intara ya Gitega. Tukaba dukora uburimyi n'ubworozi. Kugeza isaha tugeze ku mpene 43. Mu burimyi naho twarakose imirima 2 tugerageje guharura ni hegitari 2.5.
Kandi twoja nko mu ntara ya Muyinga, aho abafasoni bagiye hamwe bashiraho ihinguriro rihingura ivyo barimye, ibigori, ibiharage, aho babihongoramwo ubuyi, ubwo buyi bakabudandaza hagati yabo no mu bandi babanye.
Kuvuga abanyagihugu bino barafitiye akamaro kanini ya gose, barabushima n'ubuye bumeze neza gose. Nico gituma twemo turasaba yuko mwodufata mu mugongo kugira uyu mugambi ubandanye. ICNDH yari yagerageje kudufata mu mugongo, iraduha agafashanyo gatoya ariko ntaradufashije gusa. Twashoboye gukora utuntu nyene dukeya.
Aha twibaza yuko mu Burundi abapfasoni basanzwe ari ibice 52%, usize inyuma ari ibice 52% nta terambere ramo wahavuronka, nta n'iryo wahava ushikira. Iyo kampanye Imams for She rero nituma abapfasoni bashobora gutera imbere, bakiteza imbere, bagateza imbere imiryango yabo, bagateza imbere kibano cabo, bakongera kandi bagateza imbere n'igihugu cabo. Murakoze.
Wow, that's a really powerful short video that we watched that highlights the hashtag Imams for She initiative, where imams support a woman's right to economic independence. This is largely an initiative that's intended to challenge the Muslim faith leaders that preach a woman's place is at home. Muslims for Progressive Values with partners in Burundi, as you see, are countering that with the hashtag Imams for She initiative, which you can Google and search more information about online. This is one example of how a faith organization, again, is doing really impactful, practical work in order to, with the United Nations, in alignment and collaboration, all coming together to achieve our SDGs. So we're going to move to our panel now that we've set the stage with a few words in the video. in order to really have a conversation about what can be a difficult conversation, a challenging conversation. But again, for the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, one of the most exciting conversations that can happen about how we really move toward that holistic, radical way that we achieve good together. We have Ivy Koch today from Soka Gakkai International and Vice Chair of NGO CSW, who will moderate the panel. Ivy is a program coordinator for the SGI Office for UN Affairs in New York. And as she engages in SGI's work, it's in the fields of gender equality and women's empowerment, sustainable development, peace and disarmament, and human rights. She does this work primarily through its non-formal education approach since joining in 2013. She served on the NGO CSW New York Executive Committee since 2014, and currently is vice chair of the committee and co-chair of the Young Professional Subcommittee. Prior to her current position, Ivy's work has taken her to Venezuela, Boston, and Japan in the fields of education, study abroad, editing, and translation. And she's been involved in projects and work on issues such as the empowerment of women peace builders, child labor, and women's leadership. Ivy, thank you for joining us today to moderate this really important discussion. I have no doubt that your rich and wide and varying experience will enhance the conversation we have today. So thanks again.
Thank you so much, Casey, for that introduction. And I will jump straight into the panel. I'm sure you're all waiting for this discussion to begin on such interesting topic. It's straight in the title, Dispelling Misconceptions and Myths. And we wanted to start with, that, as a question and sharing the positive contributions that that faith actors have played. And so I have three panelists with me today, and I'm going to introduce them each before they speak a little bit more, but just to share their names at this point. Simona Cruciani, Ruth Messinger, Renz Argao is joining us. They are all going to be joining in this discussion. And so I wanted them to start with this, like I said, the question around the title of our event and the positive contributions of faith actors and what ways in which they've contributed to overcoming misconceptions. And we really want to hear some concrete examples. I'm sure that will all inspire us. So I'd like to start actually with Simona. And she is the Political Affairs Officer of the UN Office on Genocide Prevention and the Responsibility to Protect, and where she is the team leader of the Middle East and the focal point for the implementation of the UN strategy and I can't read my writing.
Plan of action.
Plan of action. Oh, thank you. My eyes are going bad too. So
I understand.
plan of action.
Mine too.
On hate speech. And you also oversee the global program with religious leaders on preventing incitement to violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. So there's further on your bio. I know that we were going to share all of it, but I wanted you to start on that, answering that question that I had posed.
Thank you, Ivy. And it's really a pleasure to be with all of you today for this very important discussion. Just let me start by saying that my office focuses on the prevention of atrocity crimes. And for atrocity crimes, we need the genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And in implementing this mandate, that falls within the peace and security pillar of the United Nations, we engage on a daily basis with religious leaders and actors in atrocity prevention. So we really believe in my office that these actors play a fundamental role in preventative strategies for atrocity crimes. And in particular, we work with them on the prevention of incitement to violence. You rightly mentioned the global program that I lead in the office. And this global program consists in the implementation of a plan of action. That it's a very long title. It's the Plan of Action for Religious Leaders and Actors to Prevent Incitement to Violence that could lead to atrocity crimes. It's also called the Fez Plan of Action because it started in Fez, Morocco. I will share the link in the chat box. But when we engage with religious leaders and actors, we keep on stressing the words actors, because it is important for us to engage with those religious actors or religiously inspired actors who might not be in position of leadership, and many times males are in this position, women are not. But despite that, they are great contributors to the prevention of atrocity crimes and their incitement. So the plan of action that I mentioned, the first plan of action, really engages with women, with religious women and religiously inspired women in this endeavor, and it has also a very strong gender focus, in terms that it one of its main pillar, it's the prevention of gender-based violence. This is considered to be a strong element in the perpetration of atrocity crimes. We know that the genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity have a very deep gender dimensions and impact. And that's why even while engaging with religious actors, we really want to emphasize their role, their voice, and their contribution in the prevention of gender-based violence. So when it comes to this plan of action, really, and when it comes to the specific focus on combating gender-based violence, its objectives are to address cultural attitudes that underpin the use of sexual violence and the stigma and shame associated with it, curb gender-based discrimination and violence, including their gender incitement, create pathways or space to counter exclusion and discrimination of women, and include active engagement in paid leadership. So this plan of action includes recommendations to religious leaders and state institutions, and it's been implemented globally, including by many faith-based organizations. We are organizing right now a meeting that will take place in Fez, in Morocco, on the 20th and 21st of this month, to celebrate the 5th anniversary of the first plan of action. And we will take stock of the work done in the last 5 years, and we will discuss the way forward. But this is really a very important tool that we use in the office to engage with religious leaders and actors, and to stress their very important role in prevention of atrocity crimes, but also in combating gender stereotypes. I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Simona. I wasn't sure. So the Fez plan of action that you mentioned, it was, when was that created? Wasn't sure if you mentioned.
Yes, so it was launched by the Secretary General on the 14th of July, 2017. I'm going to share it in the chat box with everyone.
Wonderful. So thank you.
We are celebrating the 5th anniversary right now.
Great. Wonderful. Yeah. Wonderful. And so I will now turn to Ruth Messinger, and she's the Global Ambassador for the Jewish World Service, which she ran for 18 years. And it's an international human rights and development organization. And there is a long track record of the organization and her in supporting organizations empowering women and girls. And most recently, you traveled to Afghanistan. I'm wondering if this is going to be part of your answer to the question that I posed, but I'll hand it to you. I'll give you the mic now. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Ivy. I really appreciate all the speakers who have gone before. I just want to call particular note to what Casey said, which is, I forget the exact statistic, but the vast percentage of people in the world think about themselves as having some spiritual or faith connection. And so I think at the bottom, the theme of this panel really is, if you don't acknowledge that in yourself and you don't acknowledge it in other people, it just makes relationship building and constructive work that much harder to do. So American Jewish World Service is a 38-year-old organization. We have called ourselves faith-rooted, by which we mean we work according to a set of Jewish values, but we work all over the world. And many of the places that we work are where we work with people of other faiths. And I would say that our strength is being sure that we understand who we're working with, what complicated people they are, like all people, and what are the ways to work with and interact with them. And as a part of that work, it turns out, I think other panelists will agree, and some of the listeners, that the vast majority of people, and maybe I should emphasize the vast majority of women and girls, want a greater degree of equity and independent agency than they have. So it doesn't mean that they're overthrowing their faith or they're overthrowing their culture or they're overthrowing their parents. It just means that they're looking for ways to do more to control their own lives. And I think a flexible approach to working across lines of difference is the only thing that's going to get us through this century, although there are times this week when I've despaired about our getting through this century at all. But so it's not just dispelling myths. I guess that's really, you asked me to talk to that issue. It's, the myths are a part of the reality. So I'm not sure I want to call them myths. They're a part of the reality. They're a part of the teaching of some faiths, but there's always more there to find. There are always leaders to identify who want to make change. And so there are lots and lots of examples from the work of American Jewish World Service. I'll just mention one because we had a large portfolio for several years to work on the issue of child marriage in India. And I would just want to say that many of the grassroots groups that we found that were looking to empower girls, that were looking to strengthen the capacity of families not to engage in child marriage, were themselves people with strong faith connections, but also strong beliefs in equity and the capacity to lead and make change. And so that's where I constantly found, renewal, and to be honest with you, renewal sometimes in battling some of the inequities in the United States, in my own country, from watching what people did in other countries under much more difficult circumstances. And we can come back to the Afghanistan story, but let me just note now that it's slightly separate. I did not do it on behalf of American Jewish World Service. I did it with, which is pertinent to this topic, I did it with a group of 7 women. We described ourselves as the beginning of a bar joke. 1 Episcopal priest, 2 Muslims, 1 Hindu, 1 Jew, 1 lapsed Catholic, and 1 atheist. That's more or less who we were, but we were women, significantly women of faith. We were passionately women who continue to believe in moving whatever has to be moved to open up education for women in Afghanistan against the current practices of the Taliban. And all I want to say about that now is that being there for 5 days, we were able to meet with Taliban officials. We would be happy to testify to all of you that the vast number of people in the Taliban are uncomfortable with the ban. And why is that the case? The answer is really simple. Most of them have daughters. And so they do really think their daughters should be able to get a greater education than is currently available to them. And I will say that although we have not yet been successful in opening up those schools, we know that there is conversation behind the scenes. And we can report that at the press conference we held, one of the Taliban officials came, and when he was challenged, he himself said, basically, look at this group of women. They are of all different faiths, and they've come here to bond with us, to build with us, and to give us a message about girls' education. And so that, for me, was like a great moment to indicate the power of faith leaders. Because he was smart enough to recognize that we couldn't, as faith activists, we couldn't possibly agree on every issue because we were from at least 5 different faiths. But we could unite around common issues of common interest. And I think that was important.
Thank you so much, Ruth. I was getting chills just imagining the seven of you in Afghanistan doing this work, and yeah, the impact that it is having. And that, you know, at the end of the day, the Taliban or anyone were human beings, right? And that you were able to make that connection. Not that I have anything against the virtual space, because it's made everything so much more inclusive, but there's something about being in front of someone physically. But thank you also.
I agree.
Yeah. Thank you for all that you shared, and that we're going to continue to hear from you. But I'm going to now move on to Renz Argao, and he's the coordinator of the Religions for Peace International Youth Committee. And he's also a clinical psychologist and peace advocate. I love how you mentioned that you're passionate about mental health, gender equality, diversity, inclusion, and positive peace. So can you please answer or comment on what we've been discussing so far about dispelling misconceptions and myths?
Thank you, Ivy. Good evening, everyone from the Philippines. Good morning, good afternoon. As mentioned by Ivy, I'm with Religions for Peace International Youth Committee. We are the youth arm of Religions for Peace, and our organization is a space where the world's religions join together to ensure that all people enjoy peace, harmony, and prosperity. In Religions for Peace, we see that we see the world's challenges, and we understand that our society, our communities can benefit from an interfaith, innovative, and inclusive response. Our interreligious councils actually bring together the resources of all faith traditions, and also ensure our spiritual commitment to achieve solutions, ensuring that no one is left behind. And Casey mentioned a while ago that a misconception is that faith actors are often seen as parts of the problem. And I think it's important to dispel that myth or misconception, as we can also be parts of the solutions. There is that misconception in how religion is often blamed for acts of violence, and that includes gender-based violence, especially because of how some misinterpret the teachings of their scriptures. So I answer your question by highlighting the important role that faith actors have already taken to end gender-based violence. And to give a concrete example, I can think of the project of Religions for Peace, the campaign called Restoring Dignity, which we launched in 2013. And it was a global push to engage religious institutions, religious leaders, and individuals in concerted action to end gender-based violence. This project actually aimed at rallying and educating the youth. It aimed to raise awareness, provide direct support and counseling to survivors of violence. And these collective efforts are also aimed at ensuring that there is a shift in perception, in transformative change, and changing the landscape for generations of the future. In this campaign, faith actors and religious communities had to be reminded and had to be told about their moral authority and responsibility to work together to promote and to protect the dignity of women and girls. One of the output of this campaign is a toolkit for religious communities to end violence against women. I quote one text from the toolkit which states that people of faith have a unique and unparalleled potential as moral and spiritual leaders to be powerful agents of prevention, education, and advocacy to end violence against women. In the toolkit, we also highlighted the universal religious principles that tell us that violence against women and girls is a concern of religious communities because this goes against the beliefs of faith. Our toolkit equips religious communities with resources and approaches to end violence against women, including education and awareness, prevention, advocacy, support and care, how to end impunity, and how to monitor and evaluate programs that are aimed at restoring dignity. Other concrete actions that we have taken includes facilitating education, as well as healing programs and leadership building programs. Like for example, here in the Philippines, we conducted awareness programs on how women and how survivors of violence against women can support one another. We conducted trauma healing programs to help survivors of violence against women and their children recover from the psychological and mental impact, as well as the physical impact of the violence that they have experienced. And we have conducted this in various areas of the Philippines. We also conducted training programs on how women leaders can conduct psychosocial support programs for survivors of violence and conflict. And this same project also was provided to the youth audiences in order to help empower them to take action to combat gender-based violence. As part of our work, going beyond supporting those who are survivors of violence, we also did a lot of work to fight child marriages, which often victimizes girls. And we also worked on projects that ensured that young girls' births are actually registered with the government to allow them to receive benefits and to give them the entitlement, especially to healthcare services. In our other national and regional chapters, we work together to fight human trafficking, against genital mutilation, and to advocate for women's rights to suffrage, education, and healthcare. Our organization have already shown examples, not just on these projects, but also on how we advance gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls by including gender equality as one of our strategic priorities starting 2019. Apart from that, our leadership, known as the World Council of Religious Leaders, is also a testament on how we push for gender equality, because our council actually has almost half of its members as women. And apart from that, of course, we elected our first female Secretary General in 2019. So these examples already break the misconception of the often patriarchal view of faith actors, because in this case, the leaders, senior religious leaders of different religious institutions actually chose a woman to lead our movement. So that, I believe, is a perfect example on how we can dispel these myths and misconceptions. Ivy?
Thank you, Renz. And we're all very aware and know that that woman that's leading Religions for Peace as a Karam, and a dear friend of many I know on this call. And so I'm going to shift to our next. I was going to mention, Renz, if you can share this toolkit that you're talking about on preventing, ending violence against women and girls. Mm-hmm. You mentioned this restoring dignity.
Dignity, yes.
I think this is a part of it, but yeah.
I'll share the link via our chat so they can download the toolkit.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. And so the other part of this event, we're discussing 2 SDGs today, Sustainable Development Goals. This is the high-level political forum side event. I'm not assuming that everybody on the call is aware of what's happening exactly at the UN, but so the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals are being reviewed. One of them is on gender equality. It's also called SDG 5, and then the partnerships is the other piece, the 17. And so the question next that we want to speak about are the collaborative experiences. And so if we can have the panelists share some of your collaborative experiences and any synergies that have resulted in cooperation among all stakeholders engaged in the promotion of pluralistic societies and gender equality. So I'll go back again to Simona to start that. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Ivy. And so this is a very important question because it goes back to the really what we are doing practically. And I would like to mention an example of the work of my office still in engaging with religious actors. So in 2020, before the pandemic broke out, we went with the special advisor on genocide prevention, Mr. Adamia Dieng at that time, to Iraq. So this was the last mission that took place in person, then for many months to come because of the health crisis. So of course, I mentioned already what is the focus of the mandate of my office is the prevention of genocidal crimes and crimes against humanity. So the focus of the mission was particularly on accountability for the terrible crimes committed by Daesh that, according to a commission of inquiry of the United Nations, might constitute genocide also, in particular against the Yazidi community. As part of this mission, we also included engagement with religious leaders in Iraq on the issue of accountability. So while we stay there, we engage with the main religious leaders in the country, and we brought them together. We discussed the issue of accountability, but we also included the elements of prevention of future crimes. And most importantly, we included a focus on the suffering of the victims of sexual and gender-based violence during the violence by Daesh. So the result of this conversation was a joint interfaith statement. I will share it in the chat box. This joint interfaith statement was signed by the main religious leaders in Iraq, and recognized the suffering of the victims of gender and sexual-based violence, and also that the children born from violence are innocent and must be reintegrated or integrated in communities and supported. So the result of this joint interfaith statement is that many religious communities led by their religious leaders are now implementing it, and in particular in terms of fighting stigma against the victim of sexual and gender-based violence, and in efforts in reintegrating these women and their children, the children born or rape, in their communities. We have widely disseminated this interfaith statement, also at a regional and global level, in an event that we organized last year with the support of Religions for Peace. So we just heard from the colleague who belongs to that organization, and the Secretary General, who is a woman, Azza Karam. So I just wanted you to know that this is, for me, an example of good partnership, especially when it comes to fighting stigma and discrimination, and ultimately also the prevention of atrocity crimes. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that example, Simona. We have lots of questions also coming in that I'm going to be throwing at you, got all of the panelists, but we're doing good on time, so I'm happy about that. But thank you for mentioning that, fighting stigma and discrimination and how important partnerships are. Religion is reference, culture is also a reference. I mean, it's very intertwined, I guess. And behave, our behavior, our nature, like how can that change, right? Like, is that going to be changed just by law? At the end of the day, we know that that's not the case. So, yeah, belief and faith, I believe, it plays a role. And I'm jumping ahead of myself because I'm seeing, some questions, but let me get back to you, and then I'm going to move to Ruth and Renz after and come back. So Ruth, what do you have to share about this?
Well, I thank you, Ivy. I already gave, some examples. I think that this work with the Taliban was important. Another aspect that came up in Afghanistan is, it's hard to say this carefully. It's important to say this carefully, but people sometimes believe, because they're told that their faith or their religion dictates certain things that it does not necessarily dictate. So it becomes some part of the culture. And it was interesting in Afghanistan, one of the people in our band of women was Daisy Khan, who was an expert in Islam, an academic expert in Islam. And some of the places that we went where we said that we were dismayed that the girls were not in school. And I would just know when we went in early April, we went because the Taliban had announced that as of the end of March, girls would be readmitted to school. And then right before we left to go to celebrate that, we were told that they were not going to be admitted, and we decided to go anyway. But in many of these conversations that we had, people would say, well, this or that had to do with school, it had to do with protection of women, so-called protection of women, that disallowed women from traveling alone, and leaders in Afghanistan, community leaders, but also prominent members of the Muslim faith would say, we have to do this because it says so in the Quran. And then Daisy, who is a practicing Muslim and a Muslim scholar, would say, like, you have to show me the verse because that's not true. And it was not confrontational because she's not a confrontational person, but it was strong. And she would just say, like, I spend my life studying, what the prophet said. Most of it's written down. Let's go look at it and you'll show me what verses you're talking about. And, and so then it sort of became clear that it's not that, let me be clear, culture is as important or more important than actual religious belief, but it's worthwhile to know what field you're interacting in. And she made it a different kind of conversation. So I would note that, and I gave some examples from our work in India. I wanted to give one example of work across faith lines, if you will indulge me, that it's not specifically about women and girls, but it was just, I considered it the most powerful thing I did in my 2 decades at American Jewish World Service. So I'm going to tell the story. When Ebola broke out in Guinea, Sierra Leone, and Liberia, we were working of those 3 countries. We were working only in Liberia, but we had a great many connections in Liberia. And it turned out, some of your panelists and audience may be quite familiar with this, that one of the strange things about Ebola is that the virus is more contagious right after the person dies. That's sort of strange, but scientifically true. And it turned out, with great respect, that one religious ritual among the Muslim community in Liberia, not unlike virtually every other religion we all know about, was that when somebody died, their body was put in a place of honor for people to come and pay some respects. And so literally you had the body being dressed up and put on the porch, and people would come by to pay their respects. And as I said before, the Ebola virus was highly contagious in the body. And so everyone who came to pay their respects was getting sick. And we talked to the grassroots groups that we had on the ground, and we watched with dismay, but total comprehension, that the local response to the arriving, literally, U.S. Marines who went there to help, but they were white men in hazmat suits, and they weren't, to be honest with you, reaching anybody. So we actually undertook, and we made a grant. So I just want to repeat this, of funds from American Jewish World Service to the National Council of Imams in Liberia. And those imams used that grant to go to their communities and say, we are going to have to make some alterations in our ritual right now in the name of public health. And they introduced all of the hand washing and the use of bleach and the distance from the body that made a difference. And it was effective, and it was a very small grant, but nothing that we did and nothing that the U.S. Marines did would have intercepted that faith-based, culture-rooted practice. Only the local faith leaders could do it. And I considered that to be a learning lesson for me and for everybody.
Thank you, Ruth. I see why you say that's been your most powerful experience. I agree with you, and what a critical role religious leaders played. And so, Renz, I hand it over to you next.
Thank you, Ivy. When I was reflecting on the second question, a significant memory I have in mind, one that is brief, but one that I find very impactful is one of the things that happened during the strategic planning of Religions for Peace in 2019 in New York. There was this ongoing conversation on how we can advance gender equality as one of our strategic priorities. And there was a question coming from the participants that was raised on how we can ensure that we protect women and girls against violence, and how we can ensure that in the conversations with gender equality, we can also ensure that LGBTQIA+ individuals are also protected. I remember then that Professor Aza Karam asked everyone in the audience if we can agree to create safe spaces for these kinds of conversations and dialogue. She did not ask us to promote any agenda at that time. She merely asked us to commit to offering safe spaces for discussions on gender equality, and everyone agreed during that time. It may not have accomplished much, but to have senior religious leaders agree and to commit to offering those safe spaces is for me a big step towards the right direction. After 2019, more recently in 2021, in the middle of the pandemic, we convened the first Assembly on Women, Faith, and Diplomacy in Lindau, Germany, to highlight the role of women in peace building. It focused on gender equality and the diverse roles of women in the context of faith and diplomacy. And this assembly eventually resulted in various advocacies and actions within our movement, both in the international, regional, and also in our national interreligious councils. Apart from that, much bigger in the context of our movement is that we were also have ensured that women are equally represented and that their voices are not just heard, but that they're also amplified. I've cited a lot of work that we have done here in the Philippines, and I'd like to go back also on that because here in the Philippines, in terms of collaboration with different stakeholders, we have worked with government agencies, non-government organizations, and also faith-based organizations in actually engaging them in our projects, which I've shared a while ago. In one of my experiences, I was also surprised on how we were able to bring together religious leaders and military leaders to work together towards trauma healing programs for women and the youth. So what I saw in this collaboration is the fruitfulness of how when we put our actions together, our resources together, much can actually be done, especially in ensuring that we protect the causes of women. Ivy?
Thank you so much, friends, on that. And yes, you had mentioned something about the senior leadership and them modeling it, and I'm thinking about gender equality in general. That organizations, faith actors, faith-based organizations can also be introspective about basic, cleaning house as well as doing good, for others as well. I think we have to always have both. Shouldn't be contradictory, but we often know there are. So I'm actually going to go into some of the questions that have been coming in from registrants and chat. I find it quite interesting. And the first one is about, what role do religious texts Ruth kind of already started talking about this, but what role do religious texts, Bible, Quran, etc., play, and how important is it to reread or reinterpret these respective texts? And another question was on how was the COVID pandemic and the related regulations affecting the situation of women and girls in different contexts. So if you want to address either of those, Ruth and Renz, and Simona, I'll have a different question for you, unless you want to address that as well.
I'm sorry, Abby, can you repeat the question?
Yeah, sure. So what role do the religious texts play? How important is it to like reread or reinterpret these texts? And another question was around the COVID pandemic and, you know, how did the regulations affect the women and girls in different contexts? I would like to hear, I would like to add to that last question and say, let's not just talk about how it was affected, but if there were any solutions to that or any efforts that we made to combat that as well.
All right, so Renz might have more to contribute here, and I love his organization and his presentation, so thank you. I mean, I gave you one text example. It was an example. I didn't mean to like switch too much to that because I don't think most of us and most places are into the study of text, but it is just sometimes true that you know, religious leaders, like all leaders, sometimes tell their followers, this is what it says you must do or not do. And it may be a tenet and a practice of the religion, but it's not necessarily rooted in text that way. I do know one other story about that. This was from Senegal, where we worked for many years with an organization. This was obviously about the empowerment of women and girls that was fighting female genital cutting. And there was an imam there that had become an advocate for questioning this practice. And I remember that he once said that, I said to him, well, how do you work with women who are convinced, who are not happy with this state of affairs, but they're convinced that this is what the Quran says they must do? And he gave this wonderful story. And he said, I meet with a group of women in the rural community, and I say to them, you know, when you go to market on market day, you very often want to go alone and leave your children home with their grandparents, so the market trip will be easier. And the women all nodded yes. And he said, and I believe that you say to your children, you can't come on the long walk to market because there are leopards in the bushes. And they all nodded yes. I think it was leopards, some animal like that. And then he said to the women, then he said to me, and then I say to the women, well, are there really leopards in the bushes? And the women all laugh and say no. And he said, well, so that's the story you tell to keep your children in line. And sometimes faith leaders also tell stories to keep followers in line when it's not exactly in the book. It was a wonderful, wonderful example. I like your second question, but I want to broaden out your second question, and then maybe other panelists will respond. I think that in addition to everything else with this pandemic, I think you might have said this, or Casey might have said this in the opening, that it's led to a setback in the empowerment of women and girls because it's upended everything, some aspects of family relations, family behavior, certainly workplace practice. And so it's changed the rules in ways that people weren't really prepared for. And guess who very often ends up being dumped, excuse my language, but having the burden of responsibilities dumped on them, and that's women. And the one thing we know statistically is in the United States now I'm talking, but I'm assuming around the world this is true also, is that the more that women were, for a variety of pandemic-related reasons, forced to stay in the home without a lot of other players around, the higher up went the rate of domestic abuse. And so I'm sure we don't know all the parameters of that, but it is an example that even in what we like to refer to as our somewhat more knowledgeable societies, it's just not true that things remain smooth, or that changes. I guess the real issue here is that changes that are necessary for a health reason or for a political reason or for a faith reason, changes do not proceed equitably. They tend to recreate the marginalization of various populations, women, people of the minority faith, or the LGBT actors. I do remember that in several countries where we worked, Haiti being one example, that after big disasters like earthquakes and whatever, there were problems for LGBT people waiting in line to get food. because all of a sudden it switched to like the only people who can be in this line to get food are the grandma. But an LGBT couple didn't have a grandma, and still one of them needed to go get in line to get food and then would get attacked in the line. So I just think that none of our protections for marginalized populations are as strong as we would like them to be. And so behavior reverts very quickly to re-escalate the discriminatory practices.
Thank you, Ruth. Sorry, I had initially said Simona, another question, I will address, but please contribute to these questions as well. And Renz, either one of you, please jump in and speak.
If I may, when we talk about the role of scriptures, of course, in the context of gender equality and gender-based violence, there is always that double-edged sword. On one end, of course, these scriptures are teaching us to ensure that we respect and that we promote the fundamental dignity of every human being. It tells us all of our religions actually teach us to love, and that is to care for one another. However, it may also lead to the other more negative end of it, wherein they are often misinterpreted to mean to act towards violence against women or to treat them differently. And I think that has happened in many ways. We have interpreted or misinterpreted the scriptures to justify violence, genital mutilation, for example, child marriages, and other forms of abuses against women are often a product of misinterpreting religious texts and scriptures. So I think it's very important for us to revisit not just the way that these are interpreted, because as we know, like in the context of terrorism, in the context of violence against women, these scriptures are misinterpreted by extremists. They're used to justify violence. They're used to push their own agendas. And I think what matters is not just how we revisit them and how we read them and interpret them, but also in how we teach them. Because I think that is where things go astray. We read the same text, but the way that this is being taught in different places of worships, the way that these are radicalized or even weaponized often leads to the violence that we are witnessing now. So I think that is where actions that faith actors, especially faith leaders, should start checking on how we can now revisit the scripture, especially in the context of our modern societies and the needs that has been brought about by the many changes that we have now in our evolving societies.
Evie, if I may, I just added a document, a link to a document that I think, responds to your question, the second question on the issue of gender discrimination in the context of the COVID pandemic and the responses that were provided to the issue. So at the United Nations, we understood this very quickly, and at the beginning of the pandemic, with some of the entities that are organizing this event also, we called for a consultation with religious leaders and actors on how we could join hands to fight the impacts of the COVID pandemic. And one of the main impacts, we know, we have talked about it, is the gender impact. So the result is a commitment, it's a document that I share there. It's called the Global Pledge for Action. And it also includes a very strong gender dimension. So I just share it there, just to provide maybe a little grain of sand, a contribution that we had on our side to respond to the gender impacts of the pandemic.
Thank you, Simona, for that. I do see it, the Global Pledge for Action. And since I'm on you right now, so I'm gonna ask that other question. That in your time that you have been working with the UN, have you seen changes, about the acknowledgement of faith actors, the role that they play, the contributions that they play? Have you seen a change on how the UN member states even have been viewing this?
So in relation to gender, you know that the United Nations has been always a very strong gender champion. The different entities mainstream gender in different ways. Then we have the resolution 1325 plus the follow-up resolutions. Generally, UN agency fund and programs really implement gender under the three pillars of the work of the United Nations, that is peace and security, human rights, humanitarian aid, and sustainable development. Even in my office, we have a very strong gender focus. We apply a gender dimension to the prevention of atrocity crimes. And next week we'll be in Naples for a meeting with community-based women on their role in atrocity prevention. We are finalizing a guidance note on gender-based hate speech that also speaks to many of the elements that I heard about discrimination of the most vulnerable groups, especially LGBTIQ+. When it comes to the engagement with religious actors or religious issues with the United Nations, this is something that is more recent. I've been working in the United Nations for 18 years. And when I started to consult with colleagues on the possibility, for instance, of developing a plan of action on the role of religious leaders on preventing incitement to violence, I can tell you honestly, nobody wanted to work on this topic because of the sensitivities of religion and of religious issues, and then the fact that the United Nations is a secular organization and so on. So it's just recently that we've seen many more entities in the United Nations engaging with religious actors and working on religious issues. However, I have to say that engagement with religious actors on gender issues, now we are connecting gender and engagement with religious actors, is not always easy in the United Nations. It remains a very thorny point because of different reasons. I mean, we have the position of some religious institutions on gender issues. We know this very well. This is not an easy discussion for many, and also for some member states. I mean, and many times also governments and state institutions join hands in the fight for certain kind of agenda that are not really in support of gender issues. And then even at the United Nations, I notice many times a kind of cherry picking attitude. Some entities like working on certain issues but not on others, and they discard the more sensitive issues, and gender being one of these, especially when they engage with religious actors. So it's easy to work on certain human rights, but it's not on others. So this is what is happening, including in the United Nations right now. But on a positive side, at the Interagency Task Force for Religion and Sustainable Development that my office co-chairs with the UNFPA and with the Alliance of Civilizations, we are prioritizing the engagement with religious actors on gender issues. For this reason, last year in November, we organized jointly with the Multi-Faith Advisory Council to the IATF a meeting, a consultation on these issues. And of course, we know very well that it's not an easy conversations, but I think it's important to start discussing these issues in the United Nations and with different religious actors and institutions. If we don't start, we cannot get anywhere. And I think the good thing in this meeting, in this exercise, is that further to being the first of this kind, jointly of the IATF and the Multi-Faith Advisory Council, it was also the first of this kind where the United Nations members of the IATF, I think there are some 40 entities, so it's most of the United Nations system, spoke with one voice on the importance on talking about certain issues. So really we saw a one UN kind of approach to this discussion. In the future, I think that in view of the regrets that we are seeing in so many countries, including in the context of reproductive health, I believe it's very important to continue this conversation within the United Nations on the interjection of gender and religion. I think that this is very, very important if you're very serious of supporting the rights, women's rights that are human rights. Of course, we know very well, but also the rights of each individual without discrimination. And ultimately, because I look at this also from the perspective of atrocity prevention, if you're serious about saving lives. So I think what my main message would be that in the United Nations, this conversation, it is happening. It's not always easy, but it's very important to continue talking about these issues and looking at the issue from a perspective of all human rights and not only certain human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simona, for sharing your perspective and the sensitivity of gender. We know this, but you've confirmed it, that it happens at the UN just like anywhere, any organization. And, you know, earlier, it was Arthur who was mentioning that the Secretary General mentioned, we're definitely not going to achieve gender equality by 2030. We're regressing. There's lots of pushback. Well, I've heard numbers from like 97 years to 100 and something years. And I'm just wondering what the latest number is. You know, how many years will it take for us to really achieve gender equality globally, given what, you know, the last couple of years with the pandemic? It's probably increased even. And I think that more than ever, it's all hands on deck. We all have to work together to counter that. So whatever it takes really is my feeling. I think you might agree. But I wanted to address a question that came into the panelists box here, the question and answer. So the pushbacks, this is a question. The pushbacks have become deeply rooted social norms that religious leaders themselves stop opposing, given the continued deteriorating security setting in some conflict zones. So how would you suggest young women leaders adjust their language to positively affect their respective communities? I was like, wow, I should call on Casey actually for this one. But if you have anything to say, Renz, on that, or anyone actually, but jump in.
As a man, I believe that as someone who's advancing gender equality, I don't think I'm in a position to tell women leaders how they adjust their language to positively influence or affect their community. So I leave it to our other panelists to answer these questions, because I believe that my role is to amplify women's voices and not to tell them how they use their voices.
Now, that's a beautiful answer. And Simona and Casey may have more answers to this, but I don't want to minimize the thrust of the question, Ivy, which is like what language they might use to get their point across. But basically, you know, I'm of the school that it's not language that's actually going to promote the change. So I'm more interested in seeing what I know is happening, which is that young women are organizing in various countries, as is the LGBTIQ population in various countries. And they're basically to steal an expression from the American battles over gender. It's like, you know, we're here, we're queer, get used to it. But it's like, you know, but for women it would be different. But the point is, we're here. We are your future. I mean, and I would say in Afghanistan, I said to you already that there were members of the Taliban, which, let's just be clear, the Taliban, whatever it is, and I am not a historical or a sociological expert, but it's basically bunches of guys. It's not like there's a clear hierarchy or a clear faith, and so you talk to these people just casually, and they have daughters that they want to see educated, or they know that some women in their families who, like we were, where we happened to be staying at our hotel in Kabul, there was a park next door, and the park was used as a arrangement with a private medical college elsewhere in the country came to Kabul for their graduation. So unlike American medical school graduations, I want to say that half the class was women. But those women had no idea where they were going to be allowed to practice in a country that desperately needs health providers. And so I'm not saying it for them, but the whole notion was, you know, they're going to get organized and they're going to push. And of course, part of that, Ivy, you're correct, is looking for the right language and not just threatening. But a lot of it, I think it relates to organizing and making the point, which successful efforts by women and girls all over the world have made, which is like, we're half your population. And, you know, there's a famous story of Hillary Clinton, I think when she was first lady, being invited to Saudi Arabia and being shown like everything spectacular, modern medical facilities, modern colleges, and then kind of asked like, so what do you think about this? Maybe she was Secretary of State. What do you think about this, Madam Secretary? And she basically said, well, it would be impressive, except if you're not advancing the strengths of half your population, you're not going to be able to keep up in the world. And so I think it's various versions of that language, which I think young women, I mean, Renz is saying he's bowing out because he's a man, and I'm bowing out because I'm no longer a young woman, and because I see young women doing this really spectacularly all over the world.
Oh, thank you so much. I'm aware of the time, and we could go on and on because I know there are lots of questions and comments, but if there's anything urgently that you'd like to add, any of you?
Ivy,
to the panelists. Yes, Arthur, please.
No, I think this was such an important question from Miriam to ask. I think it reflects the feeling that I hear a lot in countries from particularly young women who feel that the religious community is not standing up for them. And the question we need to ask is are religious leaders game changers for women and girls? Are they really defending these rights? And I think this question reflects that a lot of young women probably are disillusioned by it because they see in their own lives. And there's another question around from a young girl, I think in Iraq, who says, look, in our country, they're actually exacerbating gender inequality. They're not standing up for us. So I think if this discussion has to have any meaning, is that we want to see real standing up by religious communities for women's rights. They need to be the game changers. That's what the Secretary General actually challenges us to say. We're not off track. We're not saying religious communities are the only ones who do it, but they have a very big role to play. And if they don't, women will turn to other things, and they probably have to if it is not very if they don't see that religious communities speak for them. I think we're in a very bad situation, and I think this is something that I think these young women particularly challenging us. They want to see it because what they see on TV, what they hear on the radio, what they see in the newspapers is probably not that. I was a long time a representative of UNFPA in one of the Muslim countries in Asia. And I had lots of discussions with the faith-based community in that country on this issue of gender equality. And those were difficult conversations. And many women's groups were criticizing UNFPA for even engaging with that because they said they don't stand up for us. So I do think this is a very important question. We cannot just simply saying, well, let women stand up, let they think about their own situation, whatever language. I think this reflects the disconnect that many women feel. Look what's happening in this country on reproductive rights and who is driving that. So let's be very clear. I think this is a very important message that these young women give us today. And I think we cannot just ignore that. It's a reality that many women face. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for ending us on that note, actually. The big disconnect that we cannot ignore. So with that, I mean, we have closing remarks already that I have to introduce. I wish we had more time. But thank you very much, panelists. And I am going to now turn to our two closing remarks. For the sake of time, I'm going to introduce them together. Excuse me for that. But we're going to hear from Ana Jimenez, who's the political advisor of the United Nations Alliance of Civilizations, and also from Ani Zonneveld. She's the president of the Muslims for Progressive Values and the co-chair of the Multi-Faith Advisory Council Gender Working Group. So they're going to both speak. I'm not going to give an introduction before Ani, but she'll speak after Anna. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much to you, Ivy, for a really great moderation of the discussion. And thanks so much to the panelists and to all of you who asked questions. This has been a very interesting conversation. There has been a lot of ideas that have been floating, and I also see a lot of potential for collaboration with information that has been shared among us. And I think that's basically the objective of this meeting, as was the objective of the meeting that Simona mentioned happened last fall between the Multi-Faith Advisory Council and the IATF. So for me, these meetings are sort of building blocks in building confidence, in building trust among all of us, in having these very open, frank conversations in which we're putting the main issues on the table. And just for me, the next step would be to see how we can move from these conversations to maybe identify concrete opportunities for collaboration among our organizations in the field, in different initiatives, in headquarters and elsewhere. So from our side, the UN Alliance of Civilizations, as Simona said very rightly, as co-chairs of the IATF, we will continue to be very committed to working with faith-based organizations, with UN entities and all stakeholders in the promotion of gender equality and empowerment of women, and also on all other issues that can bring our two constituencies together and at the end of the day, bring a difference to the people who are suffering the most. So thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone, for attending and for all your wonderful questions, and for the panelists. It was a wonderful conversation. My name is Ani Zonneveld, and I'll be closing this event. We know that we have a lot of issues to address in order to achieve our 2030 goals, which we now are learning is not possible. The video that we saw earlier was that of Imams for She, where we work with religious leaders who are empowering women, giving women their right to economic independence. Now, in practical terms, we've heard the hard questions. If a company was to post an employment opportunity, they will not find the qualified woman candidate. And why? Because girls in many Muslim communities are often prohibited from attending secondary schools, as we heard from Ruth's report, and as we know from what is going on in Afghanistan with the Taliban. And the question we should be asking is, why are young women not attending school? And the responses, as we also heard from Ruth, because the imam said so. And so, yes, in many instances, we know that is the problem. To give the practical example with Imam Sushi, we do actually work with religious leaders, but we work with a particular strand of religious leaders who are feminists, who are dedicated to empowering women and girls, because they know when they empower their community, it's their community that gets emboldened. So when we have on one side of the spectrum imams that say a woman's place is at home, on the other end, our imams Sushi advocates say, well, hang on a second, Prophet Muhammad's wife, Khadija, was a very successful and rich trader. She did not become a rich trader by staying at home. And so for us, it's an easy example to use to rebuttal against this notion that a woman's place is at home. And my message to the religious leaders is, by changing their language, they will embolden the society, which will make them more popular. And we've seen this with our imams. They even win parliamentarian seats in their countries. And one way of bypassing, this is a practical solution, because I know a lot of people have been asking these questions, is that we need to re-educate the public, not just the religious leader. We need to, in some cases, bypass the religious leaders themselves and work with the general public, empower and re-educate the general public, which is something we've been doing. On a last note, I'd like to share with you that I'm really happy to announce that our umbrella organization, Alliance of Inclusive Muslims, has produced a position paper, or a fatwa, if you will, of the Islamic theological basis that supports the right to higher education for young women. We'll have it up on our website next week, or alternatively, we can share it with you via email. And I think this is important for you to share with your constituency, for women to share it, to use it as a way of rebuttaling, and for young women to use it to argue for their position, for their right to go to school. I end with this reflection that I have found in my years of advocating for human rights, whether it be in Asia or Malaysia, where I'm originally from, whether it be in Tunisia, Burundi, DRC, Rwanda, or Kenya, people, and women especially, are tired of oppression. They want a life. They want their life to count for something useful. And it is really that simple. And it is for this reason that I do what I do. And I will end that. I hope that we will all be inspired by those we lift up. Thank you.
Ani, thank you for those words, and Anna as well. I think that's a wonderful way to end today. And thank you to all the participants who have joined us today. And I think we still have a lot of work ahead of us. So I hope some of this was inspiring to you. Thank you.